Hi everyone. Nice to be here to chat to you a bit about what are audiences thinking? That question which often gets said in varying different tones of voice. What are they thinking? But yeah, particularly as we try to work out what to do coming out of this particularly strange and difficult period. So I'm going to be talking a bit about what we know about what audiences are thinking, based on a panel survey called the COVID Cultural Participation Monitor, of which more in a sec. But yes, I can certainly say that some audiences are very keen to get back. It's nice to see Civic Barnsley here, as I will be coming your way when I can, because I'm just down the road. Anyway, so this question about what to make of audiences and their potential reactions is, I think it's fair to say, a particularly vexed and difficult one, because really, to be able to explain it and interpret it, we need to go back to the basic questions about why people attend in the first place. What's going on when audiences attend? And in a way, there's a bit of a tug of war going on between a whole range of factors which make people likely to attend, a whole range of factors which make people unlikely to attend. And really, that all still applies. So there could be a whole bunch of things that make people say, well, downsides, negatives, things that pull them towards not attending, things like costs and time and travel and all those kind of things. And that's essentially in tension with a whole load of other things. Do they like it? Do they want to, do they want to engage? Has someone said it's good? Have they read a review? Any of those kind of things. All the sort of social, intellectual, spiritual, hedonistic kind of rationales, as well as things like, the work that we do to persuade people to engage in the first place. So there's these two different things going on, intention, and what we see in the middle is often relatively minor moves in terms of who is engaging or isn't engaging, based on these kind of balanced forces. And because of that, it means that sometimes we can make a particular intervention, we do a particular campaign, or we choose a particular product, or whatever it is, and we see a corresponding movement, and that's kind of nice and simple. And it makes it quite easy to forget just quite how complex this sort of maelstrom sat beneath the surface actually is, these kind of two dogs fighting, if you like. But of course, it's even more difficult now, because as well as these really kind of normal things that we're used to evaluating, and we're used to some people responding in certain ways to some of these mattering to some people and not to others, and we kind of are used to how that plays out. We've then got these kind of other big lurking things that kind of come into the picture. Fear of death, the fear of killing people by mistake if you go out to events. That's not in the sort of order of things that we normally have to worry about. Similarly, we don't normally have to sort of worry about how people are going to react having not had a chance to go out for 12 months. This kind of this desperation some audiences might have for going to see just anything. We don't quite know how that's going to play out, because those are huge kind of confounding factors in terms of our thinking. But worth remembering that all of the other stuff still applies anyway. It's just that it's got these big complex layers over the top of it. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those layers, but we need to remember that they still apply to this kind of picture underneath. The key thing, though, is that all of these things, both the kind of everyday things, but also these big new factors, are different for different people. So we can't just say, on balance, people are kind of a bit risk averse for these reasons, or they're a bit in favour of going out and attending stuff for these reasons, because they apply to different people and they'll have different impacts and different combinations, which makes the process of segmentation, and including segmentation in your thinking about how people come back, absolutely essential. I mean, I would argue for segmentation being essential anyway, but particularly in this context, because we're trying to solve what's such a tricky issue. It becomes even more important. And worth saying, of course, that it is possible to build in segmentation into your ticketing system. So, that's probably a useful thing to be thinking about. There are a couple of other things that make this a particularly thorny issue. And that's these. We hear a lot about the fact that arts attenders are a kind of minority of the population. The people that do most of the attending, or at least the majority of attendances, come from a relatively small minority. But actually, engagement to some extent is actually quite widespread. So, taking part figures show that over 3/4 of people have engaged in the last 12 months. It's less when you get more frequent, but still, getting on for 2/3 attending 3+ times. And what that means is that these complicated factors that might make people more likely to attend or less likely to attend have quite a big group of people to apply to who actually genuinely might attend or might attend more frequently than they previously had. If that wasn't complicated enough, the other thing that we need to bear in mind is because of this slightly uneven distribution of a few people attending a lot and fewer people, a lot of other people attending a little bit, you can have a situation where a relatively small change in the likelihood of a particular group to attend can start pulling those numbers around to quite a substantial degree. So, I mean, don't worry for those of you that aren't particular graph fans, but it's intended to illustrate that the relatively small change can have quite a big kind of oscillating effect on attendances. So, all of that by way of preamble, or if you want to be severe, all of this by way of excuses, to say that it's a really thorny question. But interestingly, I think it's one that is much easier to solve for some bits of the population than others. So what I'm going to be talking about over the next half an hour or so is about what we do know about different audience groups, what we know about what they've done, what they're interested in, what their particular fears and concerns, whether they're missing going to arts and culture, all those kinds of things. Looking at how it varies in different ways, and looking at some of the key factors that start to come out of that complex picture that we then need to recombine with all of that background knowledge we have about the things that drive different groups. So, yeah, we know some groups care more about price or more about time or more about particular genres. None of that stuff's going to go away, but we want to find all the other ways of bringing and layering that other information in on top of it. So that is the challenge. So that's what we're going to be looking at. So what have they been doing? Are they missing live performances? Do they have more or less money? How do they feel about safety? And are they ready to come back? Now, none of these give you a definite yes/no answer. Even that last one, I think, doesn't give you a definite yes/no answer, but it does start to give us a sense of, if you like, where the pressure is, the extra pull on one side of the equation or other for different audience groups. So just before I push on, Lucy, are there any immediate questions in the chat that I should pick up before I...
No, everything's all good.
Everything's all good. Fantastic. Well, let us find out a little bit more about these audiences and what they've been up to then. So clearly, with all these topics, I'm going to have to cover it relatively briefly, but let's see if it kind of illuminates our thinking on it. So 2 little bits of background before I dive into it though. One is just to say where I'm getting this data from, and then the other thing is just to say a little bit about the approach I'll be using to do that segmentation process that I mentioned is so important. So the source of the data is this survey called the COVID Cultural Participation Monitor. Now, it's something that we got funding for from the Arts Humanities Research Council as part of this bigger project, but essentially it's a panel survey that is designed to be representative of the whole population and that we can do in a series of waves throughout the year to start to see how audiences' reactions change and develop, and indeed to focus in on particular topics at different times. We've done 2 waves of it. I'll be mainly talking from the second wave, which was February data. There's another wave which is due probably in about a month. Occasionally, I'll dip back to the first wave because we've got a particularly big sample. So for things where we need to subdivide it quite a lot, sometimes it's easier to do that with a big sample than a small one. But anyway, so the monitor is looking at the whole population. It's looking at what people do in terms of arts and cultural sector, but also wider other leisure stuff as well. So it's all sectors, it's through time, and it's linked to the segmentation approach that I'll talk about. So engagement, leisure, who people are, what they think, and then looking at these 3 time points before COVID, during COVID, and then looking to the future beyond COVID. Okay, so that's what we've got in our data to use. And then just a brief thing to say, When I'm talking about different types of people, I'll often be using this tool called Audience Spectrum. It's UK based, so it won't necessarily be directly equivalent for those of us who are coming from elsewhere. But the principle behind it, I think, will be illuminating anyway, because we see some commonalities even when we do international work in terms of some of the ways that audiences behave. So broadly speaking, it splits the whole population into 10 groups based on their kind of cultural engagement, what sorts of things they typically do, what kinds of people it is that do those different combinations of things. So we have a bunch of people who are really quite highly engaged. So these orange ones. Some of those are more traditional, like musical and culture buffs, the more traditional tastes, sort of classic drama, opera, ballet, that type of thing. Others are a little bit sort of younger, more contemporary tastes, so experience seekers and the like. There's a bunch of people who are kind of more middle of the road. They don't define their identity in terms of their cultural engagement so much. It's big chunks of the population who are kind of a bit engaged, not all the time. So that kind of, that long tail of engagement that I was talking about before in terms of how it's distributed. And there's a bunch of people that tend to engage less. That doesn't mean they don't engage at all. And again, there's differences in them in terms of how old they are or where they live or things like that. So this is the sort of model we can apply, and we can use it to look at the profiles of people and see whether there's particular types of people who are or aren't engaging, or in some cases who appear to be more reticent about engaging than others. So that's our preamble. On into the data. So I mentioned that we're going to be looking at these sort of 5 things: what people have done, attitudes, effect of money, and so forth. So what people have done, really there's 3 different things that are going on here. There's what people have done in person, there's what people have done online, and there's what people have done in terms of other sort of wider creative activities. The latter is probably less immediately relevant to us, but also does give a bit of a sense of people's cultural lives and how busy they manage to keep themselves. So, in-person attendance has, of course, collapsed in the last year. So typically, about 87% of people said that in the year before they did engage, they did attend at least once to a wider range of arts and heritage things. Only 27% of people in the meantime. That in itself is no massive surprise. What's more interesting is who those people are. So that 27%, it's actually only 19% of anyone over 45. And it's much higher for those that are younger, so 36%. So almost double the proportion of younger groups been engaging. So that gives us a bit of a clue where there have been opportunities to engage throughout this year, and clearly they've been intermittent and in different formats, and maybe certain products have been available rather than others. But younger people in general have been quicker to re-engage. Okay, speaking of re-engagement, we, certainly in the UK, had a brief window last sort of September time-ish, where people were allowed to attend a wide range of activities, just for a short window. And so what we did is during that period, we picked a handful of organisations that we had audience data about, who we also had audience data for the same period 12 months earlier. And from that, we could look at not just how much people are engaging, which clearly was a lot less than before, but notably which types of people were engaging. And this is the first time I'm going to use that audience spectrum tool that I referenced, and we can really see some of the drivers about what's affecting who's re-engaging. So it was kind of August 17th, October the 11th last year. Consistent group of venues, not a huge group, sort of a dozen or so, but we sort of picked them as a representative sample across the country. Total sales less than half, but the profile in particular was very different. So this is the numbers of people attending for each of these segments compared to the same time a year before. And there's a couple of things that for me really jump out of this graph. Those 2 bars that have dropped furthest, and possibly also to some extent the third one, home and heritage heydays, tends to be older groups, often with a bit more traditional taste, similar up our street. And indeed, of the really highly engaged people on the left-hand end of the graph, community and culture buffs tend to be older on average than the other ones. And sure enough, all of those have fallen more, and the ones that have fallen less will tend to be younger. But also, ones that have fallen less are more likely to have families, or more likely to have children in the household. And that's another one of the big factors we've seen play in. But where people have got children, that kind of keeps them attending, or it kind of drives them back towards attendance in a way that, if it's more of a, you can pick and choose and there's not someone nagging in your ear saying, I need to do something, you don't get that sort of same strength effect. So that gives us a bit of a clue just from that little window of time. If that's what happened last time things opened up, we might expect it to be what happens next time as well. Okay. So in terms of participatory activity, of course, there's certain types of that activity which dropped hugely again during the year because it involved going out and going to places, and that clearly wasn't an option. But interestingly, there's a bunch of things where there's a less stark reason for them dropping, but where it seems like various types of creative activity, people's just lost a little bit of energy for doing them. So, we know that overall most of the population had a bit more time on their hands, albeit on average less money. But generally speaking, on average, people were just finding it a bit harder to motivate themselves to do stuff. So you see a bit of a drop there. Other things, really, there's no great difference. But that proportion of people who haven't done anything had sort of gone up around proportionally. So that's quite a big bump of people that said, actually, no, there's none of these at the moment. So we can see that there's this quite pronounced effect, really, particularly as the pandemic has gone on, of people being just losing a little bit of energy. So I guess then the question that we need to ask ourselves, which we haven't got a definitive answer to yet, is how fast is that energy going to come back? Is it the case that you unlock and everyone's ready to rush out, or actually have people got a little bit listless and people just got a little bit settled, and it might be a little bit harder to encourage them to make? But anyway, we can see from participation activity that there is certainly that effect is going on. Okay, so there's been a bit of a drop. People are saying they will do things though. It's just the question will be, do they actually end up doing them? We know that people in surveys are much better at saying they'll do things than actually managing to do them in the end. Okay. The other big thing to notice about participatory activity is that more younger people are doing them. That was true before, and indeed it's true afterwards. So you can see here, if this is the average for making crafts or doing visual arts and sculpture and things, everyone below 45 is above average, everyone above 45 is below average. Same goes for photography, same goes for digital work, same goes for writing stuff. So across the board, there's just greater engagement from younger groups. That's still true. All of them have just slumped a little bit, but the broad pattern still holds. One curious exception is that younger people, 16 to 24s, appear to be doing more crafts than they previously were, or more artworks, but the other ones seem to have dropped. Okay, so again, this is sort of filling out that picture of we have quite distinct patterns of behaviour, and indeed greater activity amongst younger groups, even in terms of participatory stuff, as well as going out and attending. So we've looked at in person, we've looked at participation. Online is the other key one for lots of organisations. Now, we asked people, what did you do in the 12 months before? What have you done this year? And indeed, what are your views in the future? And pretty much the numbers are fairly similar. So 41% said they had done online stuff in terms of cultural activities. 43% said they'd done it during the pandemic. It's not a big move. It's barely outside the margin of error, but it's a slight shift. But that might be curious to a number of you, because you might have been seeing quite substantially grown audiences in terms of number of people actually engaging with particular things that you've done. And we'll come on to why that is in a sec. But it is worth noting that there is a continued appetite. So the proportion of people that expect to do online cultural activity looks like it's following that trend into the future. So there will continue to be an appetite for this. But interestingly, I think the people who are most engaged or most interested in doing online stuff in future are often the people who look like they may be quickest to come back as well. So what's likely to happen is you've not got to kind of attend in person or attend online, but it's very much, do both or maybe do neither. Here's the reason why you might have had bigger audiences, despite the fact the audience hasn't actually got that much bigger. And that's because most people who are engaging online are saying they're doing it more than they used to. So what you've got is that kind of 41% of people, they've increased how often they engage with things, as well as that marginal increase. Okay. It may also just be of interest in passing to note that lots of people are actually engaging with stuff that they've previously engaged with. It's the same kind of stuff for 60% of people. It's not a kind of big radical shift. But, you know, there is discovery going on, you know, almost half. Okay. That's particularly pronounced when you look at people who really are kind of strongly engaging with this. Okay. By the by, I will share the slides later. So, you know, where I've got the longer wording and stuff, you can read it at your leisure as opposed to I read it now. So in terms of what people are doing, the big picture is this. Before, on the left, we had loads of people engaging in person, almost as many people, you know, getting on, yeah, a good chunk of people doing participatory work of some sort, and then a smaller group doing digital. That digital group hasn't really moved that much. It may have crept up, participation has crept down, and in-person has collapsed. But that's felt very different for people in terms of how they engage, because suddenly digital is one of the main ways they're engaging, as opposed to being a kind of very much a distant third. But we also, again, see differences by age. So it's dropped more for people who are older in terms of in-person engagement. And curiously, the digital, the one difference we did see was people just after retirement age. So what we think has probably been going on is that there was sort of like a pool of people who had used computers and the internet and so forth at work, and were familiar. They had the technology, they had the skills, and none of that was an issue. They just hadn't really been motivated or minded to use it as an entertainment source in terms of arts and culture, until it became a necessity. And then you see that group kind of sort of bump up slightly. So that's what we think is probably going on there. And that may well then persist in terms of a slightly bigger, slightly older digital audience. And then it's just participation. You've got, you know, it's down for everyone, but it's particularly down for the youngest and those in that kind of middle-aged group. I would speculate there's something about looking after children driving some of that. Okay, so if that's question number one, you know, sort of what have people been doing, how sort of energized or, you know, active, etc. have they been, who's doing more of what? The other big question, of course, is what effect has COVID had on people's finances? Because once they come out the other end of it, can they afford to attend things? Have they stashed away loads of money and they can start buying lots and lots of tickets? Or actually are they worse off than they were and they're going to find it even harder to attend? And of course, as I mentioned, segmentation being key, both things have happened, but for different types of people. So don't worry too much about the massive detail on this one. But essentially, we asked people, as a result of COVID, has your income gone up? Has it gone down? Has your income gone up or down? Has your expenditure gone up or down? And how does those kind of net off against each other? So we can describe people as overall having more money, less money, or about the same. And here we've got our segments in terms of most engaged with the orange bar on the left, least engaged with the blue bars on the right, and people who tend to be less engaged in arts and culture tends to have less money. Whereas against some of the groups who are most engaged actually report having, they're more likely to have more money. So again, we're likely to see a bit of a concentration. So really highly engaged audiences may well have the money to come back quickly. The harder to reach audiences who are maybe tricky to get in the first place, that's going to be an even bigger step, more of a challenge. We can look at it by occupation, you get a very similar picture. People in often less affluent occupations, or certainly routine manual occupations, are much more likely to say they've got less money rather than more. Modern professionals, on the other hand, yeah, they're actually in the money, so to speak. Okay, and this applies across a range of different attributes. Generally speaking, it's reinforcing existing patterns of who engages. So people who are white are more likely to have more money, people who are Asian or Asian British are more likely to have less money, people with a disability are more likely to have less money without it, not to have more money. And here's the other one, which again is reinforcing this picture about age being super important as we go forward. Older people are much more likely to report having more money than younger people. Indeed, they're more likely to have more money than less money in these two oldest age groups, which isn't true for anyone else. So again, there's probably a bit of a financial stockpiling happening in these older groups. in a way that it's very much not the case for younger groups. We'll bump into why this is a real paradox and makes it quite difficult to unpick what's going on in a bit. Okay, so we can see the differences in behaviour, we can see the differences in sort of financial impact and how people are set. But also we just want to know whether people care. Are people sitting there at home thinking, oh, I'd love to go out and see something, or are they kind of lost interest? This paints quite an interesting picture. So we asked people from a series of grouped kind of art forms or activities, do you miss being able to do this group? How much do you agree with the statement, I'm missing being able to do this? And good news from our point of view, for most cultural activities, most people say that yes, they do miss it to some extent. That's particularly true of live performance. Almost 1 in 3 say they strongly agree they miss live performances. So that's quite encouraging. It's even higher if we start to think about people who are saying they miss at least one of these things. So almost 80% of people say that they saying that they strongly agree that they miss something, and it's getting on from it's more than 9 in 10 who do at least miss something. So there is a lot of, if you like, sort of built up interest in engagement. So we do know that that's there. Notable as well, actually, that these proportions that are missing things are higher than proportions of people that we've seen typically do things in any one year. So more people are potentially interested than actually even before COVID were engaging. So there's opportunity there. And to make the picture even stronger, if we look at the people who actually were coming to arts and culture before, it's an even stronger picture. So it's very much weighted towards the people who were previously engaging. So we would expect that. But even amongst people who weren't previously engaged in the year before, there's still 1 in 6 are saying that they agree that they are missing live events. So there's even in the lesser engaged groups, there is some potential. This I put in here partly because it almost doesn't show anything, which I think is curious, that vaccination doesn't seem to be particularly linked to whether people are missing live performances. So they've not been vaccinated and starting to go, actually, now I think I can, I'm more likely to say that I really want to. It's just, it's fairly even. Indeed, it's even slightly lower than people who've been vaccinated. So again, that's also partly tricky because if we start to have things like COVID certification, vaccine certification, the people who've been vaccinated are going to be slightly, potentially less keen to come back than others. Although it's worth noting, this data is from 2 months ago, so it's from end of Feb. So clearly the proportions to be vaccinated is continuing to rise and the age profile is continuing to drop. And that will obviously start to play through in terms of how people are thinking. So Lucy, any questions at this stage, or shall I?
You're good to keep going.
Good to keep going, great.
Yeah.
So the next thing to think about, which in a way, it's almost our key kind of question, which is, are they going to come back? Is how willing are people to attend? So we've specifically asked people that, so we can look at that information. But we've also asked people their attitudes around some particular things around COVID safety. What are they worried about? What measures they think would work? And again, it's notable. It's really variable by different types of people. Broadly speaking, people are pro-lockdown. They think the lockdown was worth the effort. But we'll see in a sec that very much varies by age. And again, that might suggest that the people who are less likely to think it was worthwhile are probably more likely to feel like it's okay to be out and about in the near future. But even at this point, as late as sort of towards the end of Feb, a lot of people were personally worried about falling ill with COVID. Not strongly, but certainly there is a kind of a background thing. So that kind of confounding factor we talked about, it was definitely present. It's over with about 60% of people. But, and this may reflect either altruism or pragmatism about which age groups are most affected, it's even higher for worrying about other people. So again, that's worth being aware of. Very few people were saying, no, I'm really not bothered. And loads of people think that the vaccine is important for them feeling comfortable and returning. So that 40% of people that strongly agree the vaccine is important, and that is quite a big chunk of the population who essentially are really unlikely to be that engaged until they've been vaccinated. Okay. So here's that thing I mentioned about different people having different attitudes to risk. By and large, in the population, we've had a bit of a split in the course of this last year between older people who've been more impacted by the kind of health sides of COVID and younger people who've often been more impacted by the economic side. We saw that earlier. And because of that, of course, if people are more impacted by the downside of lockdown as opposed to the upside, they're more likely to think it wasn't worth the risk, or wasn't worth it relative to risk. So we see massively higher proportions of younger people saying the measures were too extreme. So again, we would expect those people to be more keen to come out once they can. And indeed, I think we're seeing that in person. So here, if you like, is the golden question. So if we want to know what audience is going to do, we said, once lockdown's over, if you saw something you wanted to attend, which of these true, or most true for you? That you're happy to attend, you'd consider it, but you'd be a little bit unsure. You'd need the risk to be lower. And then these bottom categories are pretty much saying that they're not coming. I mean, if you need the virus to be completely eradicated before you're comfortable, then really that's not going to make a big difference in the short term. So essentially, we've got these different groups. A quarter who are basically in, they didn't need any extra kind of qualification on it. They say, yep, fine, I'm good. About a fifth who just aren't coming. And then there's this chunk in the middle. So those, arguably, is that middle, just over half, are the ones where, depending on the measures implemented, depending on how they feel, depending on how vaccination's going, depending on the sort of general ambiance, etc., will depend on whether they actually do end up being happy to attend or not. That's quite a big chunk of people to have in that kind of sensitive zone of uncertainty. We don't have a nice, neat polarization. We've got a whole load of people who are kind of weighing it up. But age jumping out again has been really important. The proportion of people who would attend something if they wanted to is double for younger people than it is for older ones. So, really big differences there. Bearing in mind as well, the point we asked this question, 91% of people in those two oldest categories had been vaccinated. So they've already had, if you like, at least the first round of protection that most of the other groups hadn't, and yet they're still much more reluctant to attend. That's also true for some of these segments. So getting on for half of community land culture buffs, despite them being relatively more reluctant to attend, and even more of this other group called home and heritage. So mid-engaged, tend to be older, tend to more traditional tastes. So what we're seeing is some of these groups who have been historically quite a key part of cultural audiences actually having quite a substantial reluctance, even despite having been vaccinated. And there's a bit of a geographical flavour to it. There are big margin of errors around some of these things, but it's enough to be able to say that London does appear to be a bit different. They're likely, things are likely to heat up in London sooner rather than elsewhere. That's probably true in Dublin relative to the rest of the country. It's probably true in other capitals and major metropolitan centres. So yes, one to be aware of. Okay. Fortunately, the people who are keenest to who have previously engaged in arts and culture are more keen to attend. They have fewer reservations, and that's true even if you take out the people who said they're not interested. The proportions are still kind of skewed towards the kind of more likely to attend. So that is good news in terms of our audience has been relatively more likely to come back than the general population will be. But again, vaccination is not making a big difference. They're still, they're looking for reductions in risk. We'll see in the next wave whether the second wave of vaccinations having been completed will start to tilt some people, but for the moment, that's where we're at. Okay, and then just briefly, really, in terms of safety measures, we asked people a couple of questions. One was about, if you have been back since the pandemic, how do you feel about the safety measures in place? Did they work for you? Does something need to be different? And essentially, without getting into the detail, although you can read it at your own leisure later, essentially people were saying, yeah, it was fine. You know, the experience was good, the measures were effective, we liked it. In some cases, actually, it made it better. You know, sort of, there's almost as many people saying that it was a positive as opposed to it being negative, but, you know, understandable and worth it. So remarkably, you know, positive picture in terms of response to safety measures, I think. So we can have some confidence from that. It means, you know, if we do in the future the kinds of things that have been done when people have been able to open through the pandemic, and follow any obviously new guidance and new procedures, people are likely to come with us. They're likely to think it's okay. And indeed, once they've experienced it, they're probably more likely to come back because they know what to expect and they feel comfortable. Okay. We also said, if there was a safety accreditation, would that make you feel more comfortable about attending? And the headline is, well, yes, kind of. You know, almost half of people said, yeah, it would to some extent, but really, it's not a huge difference. It's not a really, really strong effect. You know, it's less than 1 in 5 are really driven by it. But we do see there's some difference in the kind of people who respond to it. And again, I won't get into all the detail on this, except to flag that group, Community Land Culture Buffs, who are a huge deal for lots of non-metropolitan cultural organisations, particularly quite traditional ones, particularly, I guess, some of the funded sector, especially. That group can make up easily, you know, a third of people's audiences. It does make a bit more of a difference to them. So, you know, it may be more useful in some of those contexts than others. So, any questions before I start trying to pull some of these threads together?
Lucy, Oliver, what I might do at this stage is I would just recommend to all of our attendees who have questions burning, just to get them into the Q&A as soon as possible so we can get through them all.
Fab, that's a really good idea. Are there any shall I pick up immediately, or shall I carry on and then pick them up when people have had a chance to?
I definitely think carry on. Let's get the summary in and then we can fire ahead with some questions.
Smashing, okay. So, I said at the beginning that we had this really complex picture. So we've got all these other factors going along that affect who engages and when and how. Big changes in the external environment, these big questions about people's, you know, fear, but also, you know, hope to attend, all kind of muddled together. We've seen on the way through this that some people, particularly younger people, particularly people in urban centres, are often more active. They're keener to come back when they see the opportunity. There's some indication where there's likely to be changes in the format of events, that some groups, so some of those highly engaged groups like metroculturals, experience seekers, are relatively more likely to want to go with the flow in terms of things being different. If they're okay with the idea that it isn't as it always was. Some of the more traditional groups may be a little bit less, you know, less comfortable with that, maybe a little bit more risk averse, maybe a bit more concerned about how it goes. So the net result of that is, if we haven't got a sort of a definitive answer in terms of how people are going to behave, we can still at least start to get a bit of a sense of what are the factors pushing people in one direction or another. Now, there's, you know, said that people who are vaccinated in themselves aren't more likely to engage, but we do think that vaccination itself is a push factor. It's just that the profile of those people is kind of skewing in the other direction, so it's kind of balancing out. So vaccination itself is probably a bit of a positive. Being younger is a bit of a positive. We've seen that, you know, repeatedly. But we've also seen that previous engagement seems to really matter. So particularly even when we've got groups who they may have some hesitation, probably the people in those groups who are existing audiences or have an existing relationship, they may come back, whereas other people really, it's going to be much harder to convert people. It's going to be harder to draw people out in that sense. We've seen the importance of affluence, families, and that role, and more contemporary work. And of course, the setting will make a difference. So in the separate context, we've looked at people's attitudes to being indoors or outdoors and things like that. That seems to make more of a difference than the type of indoor setting. So it's really about, is it indoor or outdoors? Is the key driver there? And once we start taking all these different factors and start to kind of look at the different types of people in the population and see which of these sort of exist for different people, we start to get a bit of a sense of who is relatively more likely to be attending and relatively less likely to be attending. So metrocultural experience seekers, super high engaged, quite contemporary, very urban, often highly educated, more kind of contemporary tastes, are we can be relatively confident about those. So for some cultural organisations, that's going to be massively good news, because those can be a really key part of lots of sort of particularly metropolitan audiences and things like contemporary arts and so forth. Home and heritage heydays, these older groups tend to be more traditional, often more rural. There's a bit of resistance there. But as well as these other groups who we've got a bit of a clear steer on, there are still quite big groups of people who there are really good reasons for them to be expected to engage more and also to engage less. So some organisations I've spoken to have said, oh, we put a programme on for sale, and our traditional community land culture buffs started booking in spades. They're booking really fast. We think they're really keen. But it's probably just that highly engaged core of that group. The rest of the group may be much harder to attract. So I think really the big question for me, and in a way, the question which I think is really hard to answer, despite the fact these two groups, these top two listed here, are a really big chunk of cultural audiences, we don't know whether these two groups are going to come back. And that really is going to be the litmus test for lots of organisations, and that's where the challenge lies. Which means the more we can find out about those people, and the more information you've got about them in your own system, then the better. So there we are. Hopefully that gives you at least some clues as to where to start looking in terms of audience behaviours, and you can weigh your own audiences against these kind of factors to think about how they'll be affected. But any questions?
Yes, Oliver, we definitely have questions, so I might just fire them away. But thank you so much. I mean, some of the feedback that's been, coming in through the chat is just, it's really invaluable. There's so much there just to really take in. But Mark Gordon has just dropped a quick one. He mentions that he just may have missed it, but is there any data on the different segments time frame of return, whether certain audiences will return come the proposed relaxation dates, or whether they'll have more of a wait and see attitude?
Not directly, except this stuff about how willing they are to attend, or are they attending with reservations. So we are seeing a bit of a tendency. I'm slightly hesitant because the more recent sample was slightly smaller, so it's harder to get the granularity on it. But there is a tendency for the ones on this screen on the right-hand side to be likely to be faster back, as well as more comfortable. So yeah, that's what we're expecting. So in a way, we're kind of expecting a bit of a lull for some of the other groups. It's just, is there a lull and then they come back? Or is there just a bit of a lull and then we realise that the key audience has got a bit missing?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, someone's just put in a comment there. Thank you to Laura in our chat, saying that their home and heritage and heyday groups are booking like wildfire.
Oh,
so
which organisation? That's really interesting.
Yeah, Laura, if you manage to pop that into the chat there, if you're happy to disclose that, and I can read it out. But in the meantime, we have another question just coming in from Bridget, wondering, do you think it'll be a quick bounce back as things are possible, or will it take time to build even amongst those who are keen to come back?
Well, in a way, that's sort of the question I've been very careful not to directly answer, because I think of all this complexity, it's really hard to know whether one factor is suddenly going to overwhelm all the others. My hunch is that there probably will be a pretty fast return, but it might be, for some groups, it's a quick bounce back, but then it sort of lags a bit because there's a built up pressure and then it goes. Almost the same way you get that kind of classic curve when someone opens a new venue. You get kind of like a big burst and then it dies back. I suspect for some of the older groups, unless they're quite confident and and trust the organisation really well, that might be where there's a bit more hesitation. But if people are coming and enjoying it and feeling comfortable, word of mouth will spread pretty fast, obviously.
Yeah, definitely. And Oliver, I just have one question, and I know I don't want to keep you too long, and we're about to start our next slot, but if you were to just give a recommendation to some of the organizations who are on today, so bearing in mind that potentially looking at research and data in kind of the way that you've presented it before, you know, and what you're reporting on is nearly entirely like emotive as well, which is absolutely fascinating. So now that teams are slightly reduced and potentially, you know, some key members are still on furlough, where is the best place for organizations to kind of tackle some of the insights that you've shared today? Like, where would you recommend?
If it doesn't going to sound horrendously immodest, our website, we're using that as a place where we're kind of storing a lot of the resources as they come out, and obviously as new things come out. So that's theaudienceagency.org. That's probably a key place to look. So yeah, I probably would start there if you're short of time, and also try and keep adding to and referencing back to what you already know about your audiences, because you know what you've already learned in the past, that'll still be the filter that lots of people are making these calculations through, albeit with all these extra factors on top.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. We've actually managed to get through all of the questions as well, and take some of the feedback too. So I just want to, on behalf of Ticket Solve, Oliver, really thank you and your team for putting together such an insightful presentation. Yeah, we've lots of comments coming in here. So thank you so much, and thank you for all of your time.
Well, no, I hope it's useful. And as I say, I'll share the slides, and if anyone got any questions, then my contact details are there somewhere. There we are.
Oh, amazing.
So yes, do please get in touch. Lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.